Hey everyone, welcome to IADS Retail Park. Whether you've been listening since day one or this is your first time joining us, either way, I'm really glad you're here. This is the podcast where we dig into what's actually happening in retail right now. The International Association of Department Stores brings together some of the biggest names in the industry, and what we do here is get beyond the buzzwords and surface level trends. We're talking about the real strategies, the tough decisions, and the innovations that are reshaping how department stores and retailers operate. I'm Maya, and today we're getting into something that's been causing a lot of debate, maybe even some arguments in retail leadership circles. It's this question of merchant intuition versus data driven decisions. The whole should we trust our gut or trust the numbers conversation. But what if I told you that might be the wrong question to ask in the first place? I've got Christine Montard with me today. Christine runs markets and events at IADS, and she's been guiding the Academy program, which, by the way, has been developing retail leaders for 30 years now. She just wrote this exclusive based on what the 2025 Academy cohort uncovered, and honestly, their findings flip the script on how we've been thinking about the merchant role. Christine, welcome back to the Retail Park. Now, I'm really curious because I know this group started with what seemed like a pretty straightforward question, but ended up somewhere totally different.
Thanks, Maya. It's wonderful to be here with both you and our listeners today. And you're absolutely right about the journey this cohort took. We started by asking, how do we become better merchants, moving from intuition to data driven decisions? But by the end of the 9-month program, the participants had completely reframed the question. It stopped being about choosing between gut feeling and algorithms and became about reimagining the entire merchant role from the ground up.
Let's set the stage for everyone listening. As we mentioned, the IADS Academy has been running for 3 decades, training over 200 executives from member companies around the world. Christine took over in 2020, and our member CEOs have defined the big question the cohort will tackle. What made this particular question, this tension between intuition and data, the urgent priority for 2025?
There's this intriguing concern we kept hearing about from our members. You have these organizations that are absolutely swimming in data. They've invested millions in analytics platforms, they have years of transaction histories, sophisticated customer journey mapping, behavioral tracking across channels, the works. But despite all that infrastructure, performance gaps keep showing up. Sales targets are being missed, customer loyalty is eroding, differentiation is getting harder. When you dig into the reasons why, it's rarely because they don't have enough information. The problem is that different parts of the organization are using that data to optimize for completely contradictory goals. Finance is laser focused on profitability and cost containment. Buying teams are managing vendor relationships and category margins. Operations is worried about conversion rates and labor efficiency. Marketing is chasing brand awareness and acquisition metrics. Everyone genuinely believes they're being customer centric, but they're all staring at different dashboards and making conflicting calls.
So you're saying the constraint isn't data scarcity, it's organizational alignment. That's a fundamentally different problem to solve.
It really is. And there's another layer that makes this even more complex. The merchant role itself has been evolving in ways that don't always build the capabilities department stores actually need. In markets where the concession model has become dominant, merchants are increasingly managing space allocation and partner relationships rather than making full buy and sell through decisions with real inventory risk. That shift changes everything about talent development. You can end up with teams that are operationally excellent at managing a portfolio of brands, but they may never develop that instinct that comes from actually putting your own capital at risk and living with the consequences of your buying decisions.
Which now brings us to this concept the cohort developed, the experience architect. You're essentially saying the traditional merchant playbook, managing assortments, negotiating with vendors, hitting margin targets, that's no longer sufficient on its own.
It's necessary but not sufficient anymore. The experience architect shifts the merchant's purpose from being a product curator to becoming someone who builds authentic consumer intimacy. In this model, selling products becomes the means to an end rather than the end itself. What really matters is creating experiences that make customers want to return, that make discovery feel personal, that spark genuine emotional connection. These merchants work much more closely with marketing teams than what would traditionally transpire. They're curating content experiences both online and offline. They're orchestrating entire ecosystems, bringing together suppliers, partners, services, even entertainment to deliver something that goes way beyond the transaction. And here's what's critical: they're using real time data and consumer insights to adapt to trends and behavioral shifts as they're happening, not waiting until the end of a buying season to see what worked and what didn't.
That scope sounds broader than what most buying teams are set up to handle today. How do you prevent that expansion from becoming so diffuse that the role loses definition?
Now, that's the right question to ask, Maya. What the cohort identified were four foundational pillars that actually define this expanded role and keep it focused. The first pillar is decode the customer. This isn't just tracking purchase behavior or what people click on. It's understanding the motivations behind those actions, the emotional drivers, the emerging signals that quantitative data alone will never capture. The second pillar is automate to elevate. So basically, you use AI and automation to absorb the routine analytical work, the stuff that's repeatable and rule based. So merchants have the cognitive bandwidth to focus on strategy, creativity, and storytelling. McKinsey's research shows that automation is going to fundamentally reshape planning, pricing, and inventory replenishment over the next few years. The strategic question for organizations is whether merchants get freed up to do higher value work or whether they just become passive observers watching algorithms make decisions.
That automation piece is where a lot of anxiety lives for people. There's this underlying fear that data and algorithms are going to replace human judgment entirely. Christine, can you tell us, how did the cohort think about where merchants should trust their instincts versus where they should defer to what the data says?
This is where things got really interesting. The cohort had a lecture from Professor Robert Ruderkirk from RSM Erasmus University, and he helped flip the conversation by making a distinction between data driven organizations and decision driven organizations.
Hold on there. You're going to have to break that down for us because I think many people would assume those terms are interchangeable.
I totally get that, Maya. They do sound similar, but they're fundamentally different orientations. Data driven organizations start by asking, what data do we have? And then try to figure out what to do with it. They're letting the available information dictate the questions. Decision driven organizations flip that around. They start by asking, what decisions do we need to make and what data would actually help us make those decisions better? That inversion changes your entire approach to analytics. Professor Ruderkirk also introduced this analytics maturity model that really resonated with the group. Most retailers, he argued, are still stuck at the descriptive level. They can tell you what happened last quarter with great precision, but they struggle to climb up to diagnostic analytics, understanding why it happened, let alone predictive, prescriptive, or eventually autonomous optimization. And here's the key insight for fashion merchandising specifically: the tension between art and science isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature, it's definitional. Creative instinct and aesthetic judgment have to remain foundational. Data provides essential guardrails and validation, but it can't replace the creative spark that makes certain assortments compelling.
Can you give us a concrete example of how this decision driven mindset plays out in the real world?
One of the most compelling case studies Professor Ruderkirk shared was comparing two different strategic approaches in electronics retail. On one side, you have a legacy player with extensive physical presence across Europe who went all in on a marketplace model. They rapidly expanded their third-party seller offerings, dramatically increasing their product catalog in just months. The strategic logic was about achieving scale and capital efficiency, less inventory risk sitting on their balance sheet, more variety for customers. But trade-offs emerged almost immediately. They lost control over fulfillment quality in ways that affected the customer experience. Consistency became harder to maintain. They're essentially betting that sheer breadth wins even if it costs them some experiential coherence.
And the alternative approach was completely different?
Diametrically opposite. The contrasting retailer, a digitally native company expanding into physical stores, built their entire strategy around curated depth rather than marketplace breadth. They developed what they call a consideration matrix, essentially a decision tree organized around what actually matters to customers when they're choosing products, brand reputation, price point, performance specs, specific use cases, not what margin the retailer can extract. Using this framework, they significantly reduced their online product count while simultaneously increasing sales and gaining market share. Their customer satisfaction scores rival premium brands like Apple. That outcome happened because they weren't trying to be everything to everyone. They were being ruthlessly disciplined about exactly what not to offer and being able to articulate why.
That's a powerful example of less being more when it's strategically chosen.
Exactly. And for listeners who want the detailed metrics and specific frameworks behind these examples, the full IAD's exclusive goes much deeper into the methodology and outcomes. But the strategic lesson here is universal. Merchant success increasingly lies not in offering more, but in knowing precisely what not to offer and why that discipline creates value.
So, if I understand correctly, Christine, merchant excellence in this context is less about having the courage to say yes to more products and more about having the conviction to say no to the wrong ones, even when they might generate short term revenue.
Yes, Maya, that's precisely the experience architect mandate. To execute at that level, you need deep understanding of how customers actually make decisions in your category. You need to monitor comprehensive performance metrics that go beyond the revenue and gross margin. You need to make disciplined exclusion decisions that require real conviction and the organizational support to defend them. And you need cross functional alignment so the experience you're promising through your curation actually gets delivered consistently across every touch point.
The cohort also developed this 8 stage merchant product lifecycle framework that maps where analytical rigor should dominate decision making versus where human intuition needs to lead. Walk us through the critical inflection points in that framework.
This framework was one of the cohort's most practical contributions. It starts with pre market work, which remains heavily science driven, analyzing category performance from previous periods, establishing financial guardrails, defining SKU frameworks that prevent undisciplined buying. But when you move into go to market, that's where the balance shifts toward intuition. This is where merchant taste and judgment become paramount. You're balancing financial constraints with creative instinct about what's going to emotionally resonate with your customer base. Post market order writing tries to blend both approaches using analytics for planning but informed by that earlier creative judgment. Post buy operations swing back to being science dominated, inventory flow optimization, allocation algorithms, logistics efficiency, etc. But then you hit these stages where traditional approaches have missed opportunities. Product education has typically defaulted to technical specifications and feature lists. The cohort is arguing that needs to shift towards storytelling that explains the emotional connection, helping customers understand not just what the product does, but why they should care. Visual merchandising directives have historically been about consistency and uniformity across locations. They should become vehicles for immersive narratives and cross category storytelling that creates memorable experiences rather than just displaying merchandise.
So you're shifting from product presentation to experience creation.
That's right, Maya. Then in season maintenance is where you move from reactive dashboard monitoring, sales are down 15%, we need to discount, to proactive trend chasing and experimental inventory management. Data gives you the speed to respond in near real time, but human intuition determines which emerging trends are worth amplifying with inventory bets and which ones are just noise. End of season reset returns to science for margin management, clearance optimization, and inventory disposition, but it's informed by all the richer insights you capture during the active season.
This framework really clarifies where organizations should be investing in analytical automation versus where they need to protect space for human creativity and judgment. Let's talk about AI specifically because there's so much hype and anxiety swirling around it. Where does AI actually fit in this model?
Dr. Christopher Nee, who's an honorary advisor at IADS, was refreshingly clear eyed about this with the Academy participants. He emphasized that AI represents high speed calculation. It's not intelligence in any meaningful sense, and it's certainly not creativity or imagination. The value proposition is handling repetitive, routine analytical tasks at scale, which frees up merchant time and cognitive capacity for creative and strategic challenges that actually require human judgment. But Christopher also warned about a real danger, which is using AI recommendations as accountability shields. The "it wasn't me, it was the algorithm" defense. That represents an abdication of professional responsibility, not an elevation of decision making quality.
That was a nice touch to add Dr. Christopher Nee in the mix. We've had him on the podcast a few times. Thinking about what you've just said, I wanted to ask, how do you prevent that abdication from becoming the default behavior?
Well, Christopher recommends building what he calls AI sandboxes, controlled environments where merchants can test algorithmic recommendations against their own judgment in low stakes scenarios. You create space to see where the AI gets things right, where it misses important context, where your human instinct catches nuances that didn't show up in the training data. Over time, merchants calibrate their confidence and develop meta instinct about when to trust the algorithm and when their expertise should override it. But there's a prerequisite for this to work. Organizations need to actively develop and codify human decision making skills that might otherwise atrophy. That means explicitly rejecting what Dr. Nee calls simplistic dataism, the magical thinking that if you just analyze enough data, the objectively correct answer will reveal itself. It means ensuring decision makers maintain direct engagement with customers and frontline teams rather than making calls from executive ivory towers. And it means making implicit skills like intuition more explicit through structured reflection and deliberate training.
As this episode comes to a close, what's the single most important insight you want retail leaders to take from this Academy work?
During the cohort's final presentation to the CEOs, the participants asked a simple but profound question. How do you want your customers to feel? The collective answer was inspired, valued, cherished, but achieving that requires genuinely transcending transactional thinking. Product discovery has to feel personally relevant. Every visit should spark some form of emotional response. Customers need to feel like they're part of a community with shared values, not just a loyalty program with points. This isn't soft aspirational language disconnected from commercial reality. It's actually integration that makes commercial success sustainable over time. Data tells merchants what customers did. Intuition helps explain why they did it and, more importantly, what they might value next. Often, the merchant's job is figuring out what customers want before customers themselves can articulate it. The department stores that are going to thrive in this environment are the ones that stop treating intuition versus data as a binary choice. They're building organizational architectures where both sources of insight inform every significant decision. The merchants who will succeed are those who develop the capability to let data sharpen their intuition while simultaneously letting intuition guide which data actually matters in context. That integration, commercially rounded, genuinely customer obsessed, and continuously evolving. That's what merchant excellence looks like when you're operating in an age of both unprecedented data availability and irreplaceable human insight.
Christine, thank you so much for walking us through what this cohort discovered and for the thought leadership you're bringing to how we develop merchant talent for the future that's already here.
Thank you, Maya. And thanks to everyone listening. This cohort challenged all of us to think differently, and I'm genuinely excited to see how these ideas get translated into practice across our member organizations.
For those of you listening, the full exclusive that Christine authored is available on our Substack at IIDS. Exclusive Insights. The link will be right there in your episode description, along with ways to connect with Christine on LinkedIn. If this conversation challenged how you think about merchant roles, organizational decision making, or how your teams balance creative judgment with analytical rigor, I hope you'll share this episode with your colleagues. Thanks again for spending this time with us on the IDS Retail Park. Until our next episode, keep evolving, stay curious, and remember, in retail today, adaptation isn't optional. It's the only viable path to survival. This podcast uses AI cloned voices created with human oversight to ensure quality and accuracy.